That night changed everything in ways I never saw coming. It all started with a simple request from my stepmother, Clara, asking me to stay at home while Dad went on his usual fishing trip. At the time, it seemed routine. After all, most weekends were just the two of us. But what I didn't realize was that this night would develop into something far beyond the ordinary. A night that would push the boundaries of our relationship and leave an indelible mark on me. The house was uncharacteristically quiet that morning. The usual hum of Dad's presence was gone, and the silence felt strange. I had just finished my homework and was ready to relax when Clara called me into the living room. "Can you help me with something?" Her voice was soft, almost casual. I could tell she was nervous about something, but I couldn't work out what. I hesitated for a second. "Sure, what do you need?" I asked, making my way over to where she was sitting. Clara always had this calm demeanor, but today there was something different in the air. I just couldn't put my finger on it yet. She smiled, but there was something in her eyes that made my pulse quicken. "Come, sit down," she said, patting the cushion beside her. I did as she asked, unsure of what would happen next. But I couldn't deny that curiosity had begun to gnaw at me. Clara leaned back, crossed her legs, and looked at me with an intensity I hadn't noticed before. "You've grown so much, you know that?" she said. Her tone was light, but the words hung between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. "You're not the little boy I knew." My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't like her. We had always had a friendly, almost casual relationship, but there was something dangerous about it today. "I guess," I murmured, not sure how to respond. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving mine. "No, really," she insisted. "You've changed, and I think we both know it." The way she said it made me shiver. There was a strange tension in the room, and I didn't know how to break it. "Clara, what are you trying to say?" I asked, finally forcing the question out. I needed to understand what was happening here, why the air felt so thick with something unspoken. For a moment, she didn't answer. She just looked at me, her eyes searching mine as if trying to find the right words. Then she sighed and stood up, walking over to the window. "Your dad's gone for the weekend," she said quietly, staring out into the garden. "It's just the two of us here." I nodded, not sure where this conversation was going, but feeling the knot in my stomach tighten. She turned to face me, her expression unreadable. "You know, I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady but soft. "There are things I've wanted to talk to you about, things I've never had the courage to say." I swallowed hard. "Like what?" She took a step closer, her eyes locked with mine. "Like us," she said simply. The word hung in the air, and I felt my pulse quicken. What did she mean by that? It didn't make sense. I tried to laugh it off, but my voice came out shaky. "What do you mean, us?" Clara smiled, a small knowing smile that made my stomach turn. "You've noticed it too, haven't you?" she asked, her voice a low murmur. "The way things have changed between us. We're no longer just stepmother and stepson." My mind was spinning, trying to keep up with her words, trying to understand what was happening. But there was a part of me, deep down, that knew exactly what she was talking about. I had felt it too, the way things had changed over the past few months, the subtle looks, the lingering touches. But I'd always pushed those feelings aside, telling myself they weren't real. "I don't know what you're talking about," I lied, my voice barely above a whisper. She stepped closer, her presence overwhelming, and suddenly the room felt far too small. "Yes, you do," she said softly, her fingers brushing lightly against my arm. "You felt it too." I stood up abruptly and stepped away from her, trying to clear my head. "Clara, this is crazy," I said, my voice shaking. "You're my stepmother. We can't. We shouldn't." But she didn't back down. She followed me, closing the distance between us again. "Why not?" she whispered, her eyes burning with an intensity that made my heart race. "We're both adults. We don't have to follow someone else's rules." I shook my head, trying to resist the pull that was pulling me closer to her. "Number, that's not right," I insisted, though even as I said the words I could feel my resolve weakening. "But what if it is?" she countered, her hand reaching out to touch my cheek. The contact sent a jolt through me, and for a moment I was frozen, caught in the web she was weaving around us. I wanted to say no, to push her away, to run from the room and forget this ever happened. But I couldn't. Something held me in place and I hated myself for it. I couldn't shake the feeling that things were getting out of control. The tension in the house had become unbearable. Every time I saw Clara, I could feel the weight of what we didn't say pressing down on me, suffocating me. But I didn't know how to face it, how to stop the slow, inevitable pull that seemed to be pulling us both towards something dangerous. The days blurred together. Every interaction between us felt fraught, as if we were walking on a razor's edge. I tried to keep my distance, to avoid being alone with her as much as possible, but it wasn't easy. She always seemed to find a way to be close to me, to make her presence known. Whether it was a casual touch on the arm or the way she looked at me from across the room, it was always there, that simmering tension that refused to go away. Then came the night everything changed. Dad was working late, and I tried to stay in my room, hoping that if I avoided her long enough, things would go back to normal. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. I could hear her moving around downstairs, the sound of the television playing softly in the background. The clock on my wall ticked loudly, every second dragging on, making it harder to ignore the reality of the situation. I thought about calling a friend, making up an excuse to leave the house, but something stopped me from picking up the phone. Instead, I found myself standing outside my room, listening to the silence that had settled over the house. It was too quiet. Too quiet. And that's when I made the decision that would change everything. I walked downstairs, each step heavier than the last. Clara was sitting on the sofa, a glass of wine in her hand, her eyes far away as she watched the television. She didn't notice me at first. Or maybe she did, but she was pretending not to. I hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, unsure what to say, unsure what I was even doing. But then she looked up, her eyes met mine, and I knew there was no turning back. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, her voice soft, almost too casual. There was something in the way she said it that made my pulse quicken, just as it had that first day. "Yeah," I mumbled, not trusting myself to say more. I walked over to the couch and sat down, leaving as much space between us as possible. But even at that distance, I could feel the tension between us, thick and unspoken. We sat in silence for a few moments, the only sound being the low hum of the television. I could feel her watching me, her eyes lingering on me in a way that made my skin tingle. I didn't know what to do, how to break the silence without making things worse. But before I could say anything, she spoke again. "I've been thinking about us," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. My heart skipped a beat. "Clara, we can't," I started, but she cut me off before I could finish. "Why not?" she asked, turning to face me fully. "Why are we pretending there's nothing between us when we both know there is?" Her words hit me like a punch in the gut. I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, that we couldn't go down this road. But the truth was, I didn't have the strength to fight it anymore. I had felt it too, the strange attraction between us that had only grown stronger with time. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself it wasn't real, but now, sitting here with her, I couldn't deny it any longer. "We can't do this," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Even as I said the words, I knew they were a lie. I was lying to her, lying to myself. She leaned closer, her hand resting on the cushion between us. "We're not doing anything wrong," she whispered, her voice deep and intense. "We're not hurting anyone." I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that had settled over my thoughts. "But it's not right," I argued weakly. She reached out and placed her hand on mine, her touch sending a jolt of electricity through me. "Who says what's right and what's wrong?" she asked, her voice calm, her eyes never leaving mine. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to pull away, to tell her to stop, but I couldn't. I was frozen, trapped by the intensity of the moment, by the feelings I had tried to deny for so long. "We don't have to follow anyone else's rules," she whispered, her fingers lightly tracing patterns on the back of my hand. "We can decide for ourselves what's right." I closed my eyes, trying to block out the sound of her voice, the feel of her touch. But it was no use. The walls I'd built around me were crumbling, and I didn't know how to stop it. Before I could say anything, before I could find the strength to pull away, she leaned closer, her lips brushing against my ear as she whispered, "Tell me you don't feel it too." Her words sent shivers down my spine, and I hated how my body was reacting to her, how much I wanted to give in. I opened my mouth to protest, to tell her that this was wrong, that we couldn't do this. But no words came out. Instead, I found myself turning to face her, my breath catching in my throat as our eyes locked. The moment dragged on, the tension between us growing with each passing second. And then without thinking, without planning, I leaned in and kissed her. It was soft at first, tentative, as if we were both testing the waters, unsure of what would happen next. But the kiss quickly deepened, the heat between us rising as we gave in to the desire that had been building for so long. My hands found their way to her waist, pulling her closer as her fingers tangled in my hair. The world around us seemed to disappear, leaving just the two of us, lost in the intensity of the moment. I knew it was wrong. I knew we were crossing a line from which we could never return. But I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. As the kiss deepened, my mind raced with 1,000 conflicting thoughts. I knew this was dangerous. I knew we were playing with fire. But there was a part of me that didn't care, a part of me that had wanted this for longer than I was willing to admit. When we finally pulled away, we were both breathing heavily, our faces inches apart. Her eyes were dark, filled with something I couldn't quite put my finger on, and I knew things would never be the same between us. "I've wanted this for so long," she whispered, her breath warm against my skin. "And I know you have too." I didn't answer. I couldn't. The truth was too much for me, too overwhelming. Instead, I just nodded, my heart pounding in my chest as the weight of what we had just done settled over me. But even then, I knew it wasn't over. The kiss had only been the beginning. There was more. There would always be more. After that night, everything changed between us. I couldn't look at Clara the same way. Every time our eyes met, I felt a rush of heat, a reminder of what we'd done, and the unspoken promise of what might happen again. The air in the house seemed to be charged with something dangerous, something we both understood but didn't dare acknowledge openly. The days passed in a tense, uncomfortable silence. I kept my distance as best I could, but it was impossible to avoid her completely. Every brush of her hand, every passing glance felt like a spark, threatening to ignite the tension simmering just below the surface. I knew what was happening wasn't right, but there was a pull between us that I couldn't ignore, no matter how hard I tried. One afternoon, when Dad was out again, the silence in the house was unbearable. I paced the living room, trying to distract myself with the TV, but my mind kept drifting back to her. The memory of that kiss, the way her lips had felt against mine, the way my heart had raced. It was all too much. I hated myself for thinking about it, but I couldn't stop. Just when I thought I might lose my mind, I heard her footsteps behind me. I turned to see Clara standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension between us was thick, heavy with all that had been left unsaid. "We need to talk," she finally said, her voice low, almost hesitant. I nodded, knowing that this conversation was inevitable, even if I wasn't ready for it. "Yes," I agreed, my throat tightening. "We do." She walked over to the couch and sat down with a sigh. I followed her and sat across from her, keeping a careful distance. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't quite meet her eyes. I didn't know how to begin, what to say that would make any of this better. "I know things have been different," she began, her hands folded in her lap. "And I don't want you to feel uncomfortable. That's the last thing I want." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "I don't know what to feel," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, this isn't normal, is it? We're not supposed to feel like this." Clara looked down at her hands, her expression troubled. "I know," she said quietly, "but it's not something we can just ignore either, is it?" I didn't have an answer for her. The truth was, I didn't know what to do. Everything felt wrong, but at the same time there was a part of me that didn't want it to stop. I couldn't explain it, I couldn't rationalize it, but the feelings were there. Undeniable and real. There was a long silence between us, filled with the weight of all we didn't say. I could feel the tension building again, the same dangerous pull that had led us down this path in the first place. And then, before I could stop myself, I said, "I'm thinking about it too." The words were out of my mouth before I could take them back, and once spoken, there was no taking them back. Clara's eyes flickered up to meet mine, and in that moment, I knew there was no turning back. We had crossed a line, and now we were on the brink of something even more dangerous. She didn't say anything at first, but the look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. There was a heat there, a need that mirrored my own, and it frightened me. But at the same time, it excited me in a way I couldn't deny. "We can't go on like this," I said, my voice trembling, though even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. Clara's eyes never left mine. "I know," she whispered, "but we're already here, aren't we?" The room felt too small, the air too thick. I wanted to run, to put as much distance between us as possible, but I couldn't move. I was trapped, not by her, but by my own desires. The pull between us was too strong, too overwhelming to resist. Before I knew what was happening, she was leaning forward, her face inches from mine. I could feel her breath on my skin, warm and soft, and my heart pounded in my chest. For a split second, I thought I could stop it, pull away, and end this before it went any further. But then her lips were on mine, and all rational thought disappeared. The kiss was different this time. It wasn't hesitant or uncertain. It was full of the tension we had been holding back, the desire that had been building for so long. I kissed her back without thinking, my hands resting on the couch, gripping the fabric to keep myself grounded. This wasn't about love or affection. It was about need, a raw, burning need that neither of us could control. My heart was racing, my mind a blur of thoughts I couldn't make sense of. All I knew was that at this moment, there was no going back. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless, our foreheads touching. The weight of what we had just done hung heavy in the air, but neither of us moved to ruin the moment. "We have to stop," I said again, though my voice was weak, lacking conviction. Clara nodded, her breath warm against my skin. "I know," she whispered, "but it's so hard, isn't it?" I didn't answer. There was nothing more to say. We were trapped in this web we had woven, and no matter how much we told ourselves to stop, the pull between us kept pulling us back together. And then it happened. She leaned into me again, and we couldn't resist. It all happened, and as quickly as it had started, it was over. I think because it was a bit too exciting for me, but she didn't seem to mind. When we were finished, she smiled at me and let me know that she really enjoyed it. The next few days were a blur. We tried to act normal, to pretend that nothing had happened, but the tension between us was undeniable. Every time I saw her, I felt the same rush of heat, the same dangerous pull. It was as if we were circling each other, waiting for the moment when we would finally give in. And I knew it was only a matter of time. One night, when Dad was late for work, I found myself in the kitchen, trying to distract myself by cooking dinner. But the silence in the house was deafening, and I couldn't concentrate. Every sound seemed to echo, reminding me of the weight of what we were doing. I didn't hear her come in at first, but when I turned around, there she was, leaning against the doorframe, watching me with that same unreadable expression. "Do you need help?" she asked, her voice casual, but there was something underneath it, something that made my pulse quicken. "No, I'm fine," I said, though my hands were shaking. She walked over to me, standing too close, her presence overwhelming. "Are you sure?" I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. "Clara, we can't—" I started, but she cut me off. "We don't have to do anything," she said quietly, her eyes locked with mine. "But I think we both know where this is going." The words hung between us, heavy and final. I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but I couldn't because deep down I knew she was right. We stood there in silence, the space between us shrinking by the second, and then, before I knew it, she kissed me again. It was quick, almost fleeting, but it was enough to reignite everything we had been trying to hold back. My heart pounded in my chest, and I knew this was only the beginning. The weeks that followed were a blur of stolen moments and fleeting glances. It was like living in two different worlds, one where everything seemed normal, and another where Clara and I were constantly on the brink of something we couldn't control. The weight of our secret was heavy, but we couldn't stay away from each other, no matter how much I told myself that it had to stop, that we had to stop. It kept happening. Every time Dad left for work or stayed out late, the tension between us grew. I'd find myself in the same room as her, and without saying a word, we both knew what was coming next. It was frightening how easily we had slipped into it. Every touch, every look, felt like we were crossing an invisible line, but it was never enough to make either of us pull away. Instead, we were drawn closer together, as if something bigger than both of us was guiding us down this path. One Saturday afternoon, the air in the house felt particularly thick. Dad was at a company function and wouldn't be back until late. I could feel the change when I woke up that morning, the quiet anticipation that had become all too familiar. As the hours ticked by, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something from which we wouldn't be able to recover. Clara was in the kitchen when I came in, doing the dishes with her back to me. But she must have known I was there, because she didn't flinch when I walked in. I stood by the door and watched her for a moment, not knowing what to say or do. This had become routine, this strange dance we were caught in, and I knew the steps only too well. She turned off the tap and wiped her hands on the towel before turning to me. For a second, neither of us spoke. The silence was loud, filled with everything we didn't say. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice soft, her eyes searching mine. I wasn't. I hadn't been for a long time, but how could I admit it? How could I explain the storm raging inside me, the constant battle between right and wrong? "I don't know," I finally said, my voice barely audible. Clara walked towards me and stopped a few meters away. "I've been thinking," she began, her words slow and deliberate. "Maybe we should talk about what happened." I tensed, not sure if I wanted to have this conversation. What was there to say that hadn't already been said by our actions? But she wasn't backing down, and I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. "What is there to talk about?" I asked, my heart racing. She sighed and rubbed her forehead with the back of her hand. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe we need to find out where this is going. We can't go on living like this, pretending it's not happening." She was right, but I didn't want to hear it. "Where do you think it's going?" I asked, my voice sharper than I had intended. Clara flinched slightly, but didn't break eye contact. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I do know we can't keep tiptoeing around it." I ran a hand through my hair, frustration bubbling to the surface. "What do you want from me?" I snapped, not because I was angry with her, but because I didn't have any answers either. "Do you want me to say it's okay?" That I'm okay with it? Because I'm not. I'm not okay with any of this. Her expression softened, and she stepped closer, closing the distance between us. "I don't want you to be okay with it," she said quietly. "I just want you to be honest with yourself, with me." Her words hit me like a punch in the gut because I knew exactly what she meant. I had been lying to myself for so long, telling myself that this was just a phase, that it would pass if we ignored it long enough. But the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I couldn't stop wanting her, and the more I tried to fight it, the stronger it became. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I don't know how to be honest." Clara reached out her hand and gently placed it on my arm. The touch sent a shiver down my spine, and I hated how much I craved it. "It's okay," she whispered, her eyes filled with understanding. "We'll figure it out together." The sincerity in her voice broke something inside me, and before I knew it, I was pulling her closer and kissing her like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. This time, the kiss wasn't rushed or frantic. It was slow and deliberate, as if we were both trying to hold on to something that was slipping through our fingers. When we finally pulled apart, her forehead rested against mine, and we stood in silence, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. I could feel her heartbeat, fast and irregular, matching my own. "What are we doing?" I whispered, more to myself than to her. I knew it couldn't last. I knew something had to give eventually, but I wasn't ready to face it yet. Then, one evening, it all came crashing down. I was sitting in the living room, the TV on but muted, my thoughts far away. Clara was upstairs and Dad was supposed to be out late again, but I didn't pay any attention to the time. I was too wrapped up in my own head, thinking about everything we'd done and everything we couldn't undo. The sound of the front door opening snapped me out of my thoughts, and for a moment I froze, panic rising in my chest. I hadn't expected Dad to be home so soon. I scrambled to my feet, but before I could react, he was already walking into the living room, his eyes scanning the room before landing on me. "Hey," he said, his voice casual but laced with something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "What are you doing?" "Just watching TV," I replied, my voice tight, trying to keep the panic from showing. I could feel my heart racing, the guilt gnawing at me like a live wire. He didn't seem to notice, or maybe he did, and chose to ignore it. He sat down on the couch and flicked through the channels like it was just another night. I tried to calm myself, to convince myself that everything was fine, but the weight of what we were hiding pressed down on me, choking me. Clara came down the stairs a few minutes later, her face carefully neutral. She greeted Dad as if nothing was wrong, as if everything was perfectly normal, but I could see the tension in her eyes, the way her hands fidgeted at her sides. Dinner that night was torturous. The conversation was stilted, and every time Dad spoke, I could feel the walls closing in. I couldn't meet Clara's gaze, couldn't concentrate on anything but the knot of fear tightening in my chest. I thought we'd get through the evening without incident, that maybe we'd manage to keep up the facade for one more night. But as we cleared the table, Dad suddenly turned to me, his expression unreadable. "You've been spending a lot of time with Clara lately," he said, his voice calm but searching. My heart stopped. I looked at Clara, who had gone pale, her eyes wide with fear. I think," I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. Dad's eyes lingered on me for a long moment, and I could feel the air in the room shift. "Is there something you want to tell me?" he asked, his tone still casual, but there was something in it that made my blood run cold. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. My mind raced, searching for something, anything, to make this all go away, but I couldn't find the words. I couldn't lie, not with the truth hanging in the air between us, so close to being revealed. Clara's hand brushed mine under the table, a silent plea, but it only made the guilt worse. "No," I finally whispered, my voice barely audible. "Nothing." Dad didn't say anything for a long time. He just looked at me with those unreadable eyes, and in that silence, I knew he knew too. As I stood there, the weight of his gaze pressing down on me, I realized there was no escaping what had already begun. Even if the words remained unspoken, the truth was still there, waiting, and it would follow me no matter how hard I tried to run from it.